Okay, so this is Unit 7 Learning, and this is video 4, and this is the third part on classical conditioning. So I had to add an additional video to go over the vocab. We've been talking a lot about classical conditioning and the different components. These are some additional vocab terms you do need to know. So you want to stop it, pause it, and jot the terms down. Acquisition, generalization, discrimination, extinction, spontaneous recovery, and higher order conditioning. So the first one we're going to look at is acquisition. Acquisition in classical conditioning is the initial stage when one links a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, so that the neutral stimulus begins to trigger the conditioned response. So this is when the first stage is when you're linking the bell and the food together to have it produce that response. Okay, so it's when you're linking the two. In class, it was when we were linking, the song with the lemonade. Generalization is the tendency once a response has been conditioned for a stimulus to condition stimulus for a similar stimulus conditioned a similar response. So if you have something that's so similar to the conditioned stimulus, you could get it to trigger a response. So if you play a bell and you've been trained with bells, even though the bell may be different, it would still elicit a response. John Watson was one that experimented with this with little Albert. He saw that anyone would respond, or the little Albert would respond to anything white, even though it wasn't the rabbit. Discrimination then is the opposite. It's the ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and a stimulus that does not signal a response. So you're understanding the difference between a bunny and a rat. Something so different to the conditioned stimulus that you don't get a conditioned response. You have different bells, different tones, etc. Extinction. Extinction is the diminishing of a conditioned response that occurs in classical conditioning when the unconditioned stimulus, the UCS, does not follow a conditioned stimulus, the CS. Okay, when you're no longer connecting those two, you're no longer going to get a response. We'll talk about operant conditioning in the next couple videos. If one stops pairing the UCS, the food, with the bells, you're going to stop getting a response, and that's known as extinction. However, sometimes after extinction period, spontaneous recovery does take place. The conditioned response still randomly appears after a conditioned stimulus has been presented. You hear a bell after a long extinction period, and the dog may salivate. So sometimes, out of nowhere, the conditioned stimulus may result in a conditioned response. And the last term you have is higher order conditioning. Higher order conditioning is a procedure in which the conditioned stimulus in one conditioning experience is paired with a neutral stimulus, creating a second, often weaker conditioned stimulus. So in our example here, the first order is obviously the bell with the dog. That was the first thing that was trained. But sometimes other stimuli get trained as well, and those are often known as the second order. So in this example, a bell was ringing, and Pavlov first turned on the light, and then he rang the bell. So now the dog was just being trained by the light turning on. So higher order conditioning is when a second neutral stimulus is paired with a conditioned stimulus, and it can trigger a response. So again, you might want to go over the list of vocab. I would highlight them in my notes and make sure you know the examples.